everybody, and welcome. Thank you for being here for our second plenary of the week. This one is entitled Ruins and Rebuilding, Academic and Activist Solidarities Across Borders. My name is Nicola Pratt. I'm the president of BRISMES, and I'm going to be chairing the panel this evening. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce the speakers very briefly. So our first speaker this evening will be Dr. Mona Dajani, who is a fellow in environment at LSE, and then Dr. Jasmine Gani, who is an assistant professor in IR theory at LSE, and then Dr. Gholam Khiabany, who is a reader in media and communication studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. Dr. Nassar, who is an assistant professor at the University of Durham, and Hala Shoman, who is a PhD researcher here at Newcastle University. So we are really fortunate to have such an excellent lineup of speakers to address this very important topic. So over the last 19 months, we have witnessed the intensification of violence across the Middle East, from Israel's genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip, to the bombardment of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and most recently, Iran. These are not isolated tragedies, but are part of a long arc of ruination of homes, of infrastructures, of memory, and of life itself. So our panel today will take up the rubble, literal and symbolic, and ask what it means to study and resist destruction while holding space for the possibility of recovery. We gather to think seriously about what academic and activist solidarities can mean in the face of genocide, displacement, and erasure. Our 5 speakers will reflect on how loss is documented and felt, how it reshapes political and ethical commitments, and how solidarities, fragile, fierce, and necessary, can emerge across borders. So with that, I will now turn over to our first speaker, Mona.
Thank you, Nicola. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first BRISMES, and I'm really fortunate to be here amongst great colleagues, friends and friends. And it's an honor also to be invited and to be here as part of this plenary. So I'll hopefully use up 8 minutes, but not more. But I want to speak about the enduring structures of ruination, the possibilities of recovery, and the ethical duties of our wider academic community as we witness the unabated and utter destruction of our life worlds and our communities. My remarks follow the structure of a book chapter, Ecologies of Siege, Orientated Life in the Nakba, which I co-authored with my dear colleague and friend, Omar Salamanca. I'm sure many of you know. The piece explores how Palestinians in Gaza have been surviving and adapting to multi-layered, not only Palestinians all across the fragmented geographies of Palestine, but particularly, of course, in this moment of genocide in Gaza, have been surviving and adapting to multi-layered and multi-temporal ecologies of siege. These are conditions that have aimed to sever life, assassinate hope, and stifle resistance in connection to the land. I will also share very briefly about the project that I've been involved in at the Middle East Center at LSE, where we have been working with 10 young graduates from Al-Azhar University who have been documenting their experiences of access to food since the genocide began. Off you go. So to follow the lead of the great keynote plenary yesterday by Rana Barakat, I also begin with a story and with a tale. And this is how we also began our chapter, me and Omar. And we begin with tales and not with an abstract concept of ruination and recovery, but the living memory of people embodying life and survival, such as Yusuf Abu Rabia, a young agricultural engineer from Beit Lahia. After months of displacement, Israeli manufactured famine, and witnessing unimaginable violence, Youssef returns to Beit Lahia in northern Gaza. Amid the ruins of his family's half-demolished home, toxic soils, and the debris of destroyed agriculture, he and his brother began gathering seeds from dried-up vegetables and planting them in containers between ruins and also in bombed-out fields. So this wasn't just a mere act of returning to what he does, which is farming. It was an act of rerouting, of resisting erasure. It was what Rana yesterday shared vividly when speaking of ongoing returns amongst and rejecting of ongoing Nakba. The rubble amongst which Youssef planted seed is now estimated to be over 51 million tons, releasing toxins and hazards into Palestinian bodies, soils, and air. And it cannot be framed merely as a byproduct of warfare. It is also not, of course, collateral damage. It's a strategy of siegecraft, a settler colonial strategy that targets homes, farmlands, water systems, bakeries, hospitals, one that turns Gaza into what Hashem Abushama calls a toxic biosphere of war, a landscape of engineered collapse where life is not simply lost, but is deliberately made impossible. And yet, for decades, the international community has employed the discourses that obscure that truth. Aid agencies, UN bodies, and different organizations spoke and warned from the early 2000s of Gaza being turned to an uninhabitable land, deploying a very colonial, racist, technocratic language that flattens Palestinian lives into charts and cartographies and before and after satellite imagery. A New York article from November 2024 featured Muhammad Ajur, an amputated child from Gaza. The piece was titled in a very neo-colonial, very disgusting way as Surviving Gaza. Muhammad is surviving Gaza. It is indeed Israel and the Zionist settler colonial project that this child, amongst millions other inhabitants of the land of Palestine, has survived rather than uninhabitable and unlivable conditions of scarcity and deprivation. Confronting this epistemic violence of such framing of genocide and the siege that precedes it and enacted and allowed it to facilitated it, rather than acts of colonial erasure, is where our duty lies as academics and scholar activists. Despite the scale of devastation and ruination, life is persisting in Gaza, and through acts of through everyday acts of survival. Community kitchen like the Gaza Soup Kitchen and traditional tequillas feed thousands of people daily, not merely as an act of charity, but acts of communal dignity that our students, that our researchers have been documenting every day. The pictures you see here were some of the bittersweet moments shared by the researchers from Gaza that we work with, celebrating a fake ma'lube without the essential ingredients, or planting some seedlings amongst yet another site of displacement, struggling to cook, but also finding ingenious ways and cooking traditional forage dishes. The researchers reflect on how multi-species, which has been a recurring theme throughout some of the panels, how donkeys, chickens, and how have been part of this survival mechanisms, and how handmade clay ovens all have become participants and actors in these practices of resistance, sustaining life amid ruin and collapse. These practices remind us that recovery is not just about a humanitarian response. It needs to be a decolonial one that centers dignified relationalities with the land. They challenge the erasure of Palestine as these practices challenge the erasure of Palestine as historical and political actors in their own right, and they insist on dismantling the ecologies of siege, these conditions, not just dwelling, not just surviving in their toxic conditions. So this brings me to my last point, which is besiege the siege. So as we write these words and as we try to make sense of this genocide, Gaza continues enduring relentless genocide and a brutal siege within a siege. Jabalia and Beit Lahia and many other localities, most localities are flattened. Youssef was killed by an Israeli drone while delivering vegetables to his neighbors. And this is the reality. What then is our duty as academics, activists, and communities in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, liberation struggle? So we must definitely document and calculate, but we also need to interrupt. We must theorize, but we need to also act. Our work must not reproduce frameworks that naturalize siege or obscure its origins. It must build transnational solidarities and support resistant infrastructures and amplify also the lived geographies of Palestinians. And as Mahmoud Darwish insists that we must besiege the siege. And I want to read it in Arabic, but you're welcome to read it in English if you don't read Arabic. I have it on my slide, so it's easier. سقط القناع عن القناع عن القناع سقط القناع لا أخوة لك يا أخي لا أصدقاء يا صديقي لا قلاع لا الماء عندك لا الدواء ولا السماء ولا الدماء ولا الشراع ولا الأمام ولا الوراء حاصر حصارك لا مفر اضرب عدوك لا مفر سقطت ذراعك فالتقطها وسقطت قربك فالتقطني واضرب عدوك بي فأنت الآن حر وحر وحر. Thank you.
Okay. I agree with them and be done with. And 8 minutes. I'm genuinely grateful to Mark, to Nicola, to Rosa, and other colleagues. It's really, really amazing and a privilege to be here. Talking about ruins and rebuilding, destruction and hope, and solidarity across borders.
They can't hear it.
Oh.
You mind to-
Okay, talking about ruins and rebuilding, destruction and hope, and solidarity across borders, sadly, is not a novel topic, and neither is the question of the role of education and educational institutions. So I want a little bit insist on some of the historical precedents to what we are witnessing today and how that might work. In education after Auschwitz, Theodor Adorno insisted on the significance of making conscious the general subjective mechanism without which Auschwitz would hardly have been possible. Knowledge of this mechanism, he argues, is necessary, as is the knowledge of the stereotypical defense mechanism that blocks such a consciousness. 2 decades later, Edward Said also famously and rather provocatively asked for permission to narrate and discuss the subjective mechanism of continued colonization of Palestine. Many panels so far have offered a great deal of evidence of mechanism of genocide and the violent assault on the right to narrate. In Britain alone, and just in few days, we have witnessed the example of the state and media responses to Palestine Action Group and Glastonbury Festival. Suddenly, those people who have been silent for such a long time over the deeds of the state of Israel became rather outraged by the words of Bob Dylan. In the short time that I have, I would really like to focus a little bit on the relevance of culture in times of genocide as a resource of hope, as a resource of resistance, and also of solidarity. Genocide, of course, are not just about mass murder, although they do that. They are also an act of aggression against the social vitality of communities under attack. In his groundbreaking book, Slavery and Social Death, Orlando Patterson delves into the impact of slavery on personal relationship and characterizes slavery as the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored person. It is not just the act of killing, but the process of kidnapping and displacing millions of people from geographies and communities with all associated characteristics of such forms of belonging, including personal status, collective aspiration that is part of eliminations of the victim. The act of genocide for him desocialized new slaves and stripped them of their cultural heritage with no independence being, no country and no identity, and belonging not to their family and community, but their owners. The point about degradation had been made much earlier by Du Bois, who wrote in Black Reconstruction, the espousal of doctrine of Black inferiority was primarily because of economic motives and the interconnected political urge necessary to support the slave industry. But it had a crucial second function, degradation. And he goes to say the hurt was the wound dealt to his reputation as a human being. Nothing was left, nothing was sacred. African history became the tale of degraded animals and subhuman savages where no vestige of human culture found a foothold. Claudia Card, also approaching the issue of the genocide from a feminist perspective, highlights the question of social vitality with reference to Holocaust and argues Hitler's sterilization program and Nuremberg laws that left German Jews stateless were part of the genocide, not just prelude to it. So process of elimination robs communities of their interests, customs, past, and crucially, of their future, and above all, freedom. The significant and stark contrast and struggle between dominant and dominated, settlers and native populations, colonizers and colonized, has meant that the oppressed have often mounted the challenge to preserve their dignity, their identity, and humanity, sometimes in the most elemental way. And I want to highlight this by referencing some of the cultural practices of racialized people throughout history who have been accused of lacking culture at certain points. Winston Brown, in a wonderful article on social death and slavery, offers an account of the slaves holding a funeral aboard a slave ship in 1786 after a universally esteemed woman had died. While the body of that captive woman was laid on the deck, the other captive woman staged a loud, deep, and impressive rite of grieving, often speaking softly to the corpse in the belief that the woman's spirit would hear and acknowledge their wish to be remembered to their friends in other countries where they should meet. For Brown, this is an example of how, despite being uprooted and desocialized, enslaved Africans retained important parts of their culture, and through that, their dignity and humanity. For him, the enslaved cultural practices and resistance equated with humanity, and he suggests resistance was the crucible in which Black people forged identity from a vital inheritance. However, the violent domination of slavery generated political action. It was not antithetical to it. So if one sees power as productive and the fear of social death, not as incapacity, but as a generative force, a different image of slavery lies into a view, one in which the object of slave politics is not simply the power of slaveholders. And in Survival in Auschwitz, Primo Levi recalls the death of a 3-year-old Emilia on the train journey to Auschwitz and describes how her mother and father managed to give Emilia a bath in a zinc bowl with the lukewarm water that the German machinist had allowed them to get from the engine of a train that was taking the capture to their death. For Levi, this small act of care represents the resilience of human spirit and the ability to preserve dignity in the most unimaginable horror. And in the case of Palestine, the political resistance has continued for decades, despite Israel's attempt to eradicate and erase Palestinians from land, from history, and from memory. Every day's action and symbols, from throwing stones toward IDF soldiers, of searching through rubbles for casualties of Israeli bombing, and parents pressing the photos of their children on their chest, as well as the production of art and poetry and of various media artifacts such as film, music, theater, graffitis, pictures, installation, and so on, have all kept the idea of a memory of a nation alive. In fact, the more Israelis have tried to eliminate Palestinians, the more visible they have become. And for Helga Toil Sori, given the Palestinian political condition, their cultural practices is an act of resistance in itself, because it de facto attempts to reverse Golda Meir's proclamation that Palestinians do not exist. More complicated than that, it attempts to negate the subjugation and silencing. Palestinian culture is the attempt to revoice the silences of the witnesses, of victims, and of historical so-called losers, and to rewrite the historical truths of events in Israel and Palestine before and after 1948. Thank you.
Describe myself as a daughter of BRISMES of the 2019 version. So it's a truly honor and humbling experience to be here in this room with you and to be asked to speak to all of you. I'm really grateful. And also to share the panel with the amazing speakers before me and Hala, who's going to speak behind after me. So when I started with a tale, I'm going to start with a space, with a place, and basically to share with you two artists that I really liked, simply because they can tell stories and give you something much more nicer than what I'll be able to say. So if you bear with me, I'll just describe two artistic practices, and then I'll come back to the themes of the round table. I want to take you first to the 1960s in North Africa. Or actually, to be honest, I want to take you to 2021. In 2021, most of Southern Europe breathed some dust waves, dust storms that hit the shores, and they were coming from the Sahara. Dust storms coming from North Africa to the southern Mediterranean coast are often received with increasingly racialized metaphors. They are the foreign others, they are invasive matters, they are stuff that even forces Europe cannot keep at bay. However, in this year in particular, there was a report about an irony. The headlines ran irony as the Saharan dust returns radiation from the French nuclear tests in the 1960s. So perhaps there was something really sinister haunting Europe after all in these dust storms. Now, the story of the 1960s French nuclear tests is a little known story actually, but it is the subject and the focus of Samia Henni, a colleague, friend, and someone I learned from a lot, her exhibition called Colonial Toxicities that has been doing circulations for the past few years. The exhibition follows Henni's long research project looking into archival material, oral testimonies, even expert interviews, all surrounding these detonations, the detonations of nuclear experiments in the Algerian desert. Between 1960 and 1966, the French government test detonated a series of atomic bombs in the then, by the way, newly independent Algeria. So Algeria wasn't under the French mandate anymore. 4 of these were atmospheric bombs in the sense that they were detonated in the air above the ground. They were codenamed Gerbois, in Arabic Garbois. For the Egyptians in the room, they would know what Garbois is. 13 bombs were detonated underground within a granite mountain. Other subsidiary experiments were codenamed Pollen, and they were further carried out between 1964 and 1966. So the code names are ironic, we laughed about them, but they inadvertently also refer to the ecological and elemental harm that they entailed. Pollen for atmospheric experiments, precious stones for the detonations inside the mountain. There was a radioactive fallout across West and North Africa and the Mediterranean. Atomic waste was left in the desert and not properly buried. It was out of Europe's sight, it was out of Europe's mind, it was buried in an archive that until very recently has been classified. Samia Henni's argument is that, and which I agree with and I want to bring in, is that it's the colonial imagination of the Sahara as the sacrificial zone, as empty is what allowed these detonations. The ecological harm enabled by colonial imagination of our region in the Middle East and North Africa as a sacrifice zone could not really go away, however. Now I want to take you to another exhibition, actually close by here, in Kassel. But instead, before we go to the exhibition, we'll go to Beirut in 2024. So in around November 2024, Israel was obviously engaging in a bombing campaign also of Beirut. And some of these bombs hit an apartment building in Beirut, killing both parents of the Lebanese visual artist Ali Sherry. Sherry was born in Beirut immediately in the wake of the Beirut civil war. And as he describes his practice, he has been oriented to sit with the effect of relations of violence and harm in bodies and landscapes, as well as the multiple temporalities of violence that entails. For him, it has been a question to ask what it means to bear witness, yes, Nassar is talking, to the violence of world events. So Sherry doesn't really always focus on Beirut, actually. This question has led him from northern Cyprus to northern Sudan. And some of his work, which you can actually see here in the Baltic, the exhibition is actually on at the moment in Newcastle. The Baltic is where we're going to have a party later on. But there's also a great exhibition I would invite you to go to. Sherry thinks of mud as a word-making matter in mythology, in religion, in gilding, in architecture, in tin and ovens, and in monument making. Mud becomes a form of historical material. In his practice, he uses prosthetics, thinking about the question of what happens when bodily integrity is not guaranteed anymore. He patches together broken and fragmented parts of other found material. And for him, as he poetically puts it, he's oriented to think about solidarity between broken bodies, a recovery that bears traces of brokenness. So I'm turning to these two artworks basically to think about the complex and complicated relations of harm, of ruination that our region and as scholars of the field are always enmeshed in. I want to think about the impossible position we often find ourselves in for people who are from the region, who work on the region, who care about the region, about these spaces, about that space that we call the Middle East and North Africa, when we are often called on as experts and scholars to translate the unspeakable. And that is often, as many people actually in panels across the past 2 days have been saying, includes a sense of stuckness, a sense of paralysis. But on the other hand, at the same time, as we bear witness to this ecological harm, we cannot also be complicit about reifying our region as one that is only bounded in relationships of loss and relationships of harm. Second, I want to think about the cycles of ruination and destruction as never really only an intellectual conceptual exercise. Again, a point made brilliantly by other people here in the room. But they are the actual conditions of our being. For many in this room, the past 2 years have been, on one hand, paralyzing, yes, but it also has been a frantic call to act and to intervene, to storytell, to glitch that sort of live-streamed genocide in our face that sort of exists with us as if it's a parallel world. And for many, for those who are in European universities, I think many will speak to that. There is a kind of dissonance of our colleagues who think about this as world affair and not background news, not as something that we carry in with every day in our corridors, offices with our students. And third, yes. And third, and this was a question that was asked us on the panel, is to think about the position of academic labor in the work of recovery and against ruination. So I refer to artwork not because it's pretty, although it is, and harrowing as well, but also to give us some clues about the instances of the poetic, and here by poetic, I mean the creative act. There is an actually creative act that is going on here. To reinvent life, to think life and livelihood, to insist on living, even like almost in impossible situations. And despite and within the violent and targeted harm. So basically expect poetically yesterday by Rana Barakat, and it's a relationship in which space, bodies and stories, even while ruined, can help to perform a solidarity of these broken bodies that Sherry speaks of. Something that troubles the reification of our region as self-contained entity of a contact zone of passively harmed, that is always passively harmed, and beyond the temporal imagination of junctures of event that inflicted on us harm. As a final note and to conclude, I'm not going to speak about solidarity, but I want to talk a little bit about like the structures that govern academic labor, at least to the UK, and that they keep on intensifying logics that actually work against solidarity. So I'm going to plug into one initiative that I've sort of spent circulated small postcard about it. And this is an initiative by a group of academics, urbanists of the Arab world, in response to a demand of one of our team who said that she wanted a curriculum that is liberated by that is not hostage to institutional relations. So even though institutional solidarity or certain educational initiatives are really important, for her, what was really important is to think about academic labor as not beholden to within institutions, not beholden to academic copyrights or institutional. It's one that connects these people, that all of us from North Africa to Sudan to Iraq, and in a pedagogical project that is not a copyrighted project. I offer this to you, I plug it to you because please take it, use it, teach with it, critique it, and thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for for me and everyone who helped in organizing this. Today, I'll be talking about a very sensitive topic for myself. It's about my life project in Gaza and how it was destroyed or prevented. So the title of today is Prevented Wars: The Devastating Impact of Israeli Genocide on Community-Led Interventions on Domestic Violence in Gaza. I'll be talking about the period, basically the period of 2022-2023, 1 year of interventions in Gaza using participatory action research in my fieldwork for my PhD as part of my life project, and how it was affected, damaged, and prevented through the genocide. And I left Gaza a few days before the genocide started, so October 23. And I kept on following up with my participants as much as I could, who stayed alive or who were able to communicate with me through the genocide. And that's why I was able to write a little bit of this. In my fieldwork, I did more than 80 interviews with participants, with decision makers, and people who are providing services to domestic violence in multi-sites. I also did around 10 months of ethnographic research at multi-sites, and more than 40 public dialogues and action groups with the community in Gaza using participatory action research. Many of my participants are now either killed, kidnapped, missing, or all of them, if not killed, are displaced. Drawing on decolonial methodologies, the campaign mobilized hundreds of participants, around 300 participants around Gaza Strip in the 5 governorates, working on decolonial methodologies to combat domestic violence. The project was focused on mobilizing the community to create action groups to make a change in decolonial manner to domestic violence. And from that, 3 action groups erupted. One about a change of criminal law, which is like criminal law in Gaza is basically British mandate law from 1936. The second action group focused on reformation of Sharia, family law, and the third one on awareness raising and protecting victims and linking them with service providers. So it was like a very optimistic approach to help the community to advance and progress. At the end, before I left Gaza, we did like a 300 pictures, images, please. Thank you. So before I left Gaza, we had a big meeting, 300 people from the participants in Gaza. That meeting was done in Rashad al-Shawa, the oldest cultural center in Gaza. And it was like full of women, men, different ages, 18 mostly to 90 years old, from different backgrounds, students, medics, academics, like legal experts, and so many other backgrounds of people who were interested in making the change. So after this workshop, we went and met some decision makers, because in this workshop, we worked on implementation plan of activities for each action group and what those participants wanted to do with the decision makers to change the situation of domestic violence in Gaza in a decolonial manner. Okay, and then I left Gaza. I came to the UK for my writing up stage, and I was following up with the community leaders who were elected at this also meeting. They were around 25 people who I had them to meet with the decision makers so they can coordinate between decision makers and community mobilizers, and at the same time coordinate with me while I'm outside to be able to be part of the change, but at the same time to decentralize the intervention that we were doing. And I came to the UK a few days later. Everything I worked to and my community or our community in Gaza have worked to was prevented, was have become a prevented world. And more than 28,000 women and girls have been killed already through the last 20 months. So like the prevention of a murder of one woman is prevented, but to very huge levels. And as I said, like multiple of the leaders of the people who participated, even in those pictures, are already like killed, kidnapped, or missing. So I'll talk about the three main prevented stuff that happened in Gaza during the genocide. And the first one is prevented decolonial change through the targeting of activists. In this first one, many people, participants in the decolonial change have been murdered. Among them, a woman who I met at my ethnographic research at Safety House, the shelter for battered women in Gaza. Her name was Misbah, and she was killed along with her own family in Gaza in this genocide. And this woman was providing a very warmth, lovely environment to the women and girls who were sheltering in the Safety House, but also she was training them on how to deal with on like empowerment and economic stuff. So they will be able to become more of survivors when they leave the house and be able to become independent economically at least. This murder of this woman and so many other activists who were part of the decolonial change mobilization in Gaza does not only represent like a loss of individual, but also reflect the structural act of epistemic and political erasure of this mobilization. A key figure in the participatory process and community progression, their absence render continuation of the project impossible. One of the local campaigners or leaders who was in Gaza within the genocide contacted me after a few months of the beginning and told me that, Hala, my family were murdered. I'm in the south, my sister in the north. I can't reach out to her. Her family, the husband and kids are underneath the rubble, and they can't do anything. And he said, Hala, we wanted to make a massive change to increase the quality of life and protect domestic violence victims. I used to be helpful to the whole community, and now I can't even be of help of my own sister, almost all of her family. They destroyed everything. I feel helpless. So like the type of prevention in that is in so many levels, in the imagination and the possibilities and the ability to feel as an actor of change anymore. The second prevention I talk about is prevention of survival, and I focus on that feminicide because of the domestic violence focus of in my project was on women. And it's about the killing of women and girls within the genocide who were either survivors or victims of domestic violence, but also the wide spread of murder of women, men, and children. During the initial days of the Israeli bombardment over Gaza in this genocide, Israel have bombarded the main central detention facilities in Gaza, releasing more than 1,600 inmates from the prisons. Many of them were criminals, or all of them are criminals, and many of them were domestic violence perpetrators. Releasing them meant that the victims are surrounded by retaliating abusers who are outside with no legal protection, no police, no shelters, no institutions functioning within the genocide to protect them. In other cases, or in most cases, the violence that women were targeted by was Israeli violence, femicidal violence, or genocidal violence. And for many of those women who were like, I was following up with them, were also like, they were victims of domestic violence, victims of colonial violence, and then they survived domestic violence, but in this genocide, they were murdered. And in one case, Rula, who's a young woman in her early 20s, she lived through a lot of colonial and patriarchal violence. In the last 2 years ago, before the genocide, 1 year before the genocide, she was able to build up her life, to become economically independent, and to start feeling that she might have a better future. At the beginning of the genocide, she was also murdered among other many Palestinians in Gaza. Her story, like many others in Gaza, unfortunately disappear as figures, become numbers, and people don't understand the story behind it, the struggles, the love, the hate, the everything that they have been through within their lives. The last prevention I talk about is the prevention of institutional and spatial infrastructure, which is suicide or like the societal death that Israel have created. And I'll focus here on the infrastructure or physical part of it. And as I said before, it's not just the people who were murdered in this genocide, but also the infrastructure that enabled our intervention. And among those places, Rashad Shawa Center, where we have met before, that was reduced into ruins by the Israeli occupation army attacks on it. Another place that we had multiple meetings was the Legislative Council. And you know, like democratically, how important to have a Legislative Council. And we were able to have multiple meetings with the man with a suit at the middle. He's the head of the legal unit, who was cooperating and coordinating with us. Like the intervention, reformation, and the legal process, we were like hoping to pursue with them to decolonize the law in Gaza. And so many other stuff. And this is the Legislative Council, and there you can see it was damaged by controlled ammunition by the Israeli occupation army. So overall, the systematic destruction of the community-led campaign to address domestic violence have dismissed all the community-led interventions in Gaza. It constitutes what I refer to in this article as prevented world, basing on Edward Said, Evasion Geography, and also Preventive Palestine book. And in prevented walls, I mean the social and political justice-oriented intervention to improve the lives of Palestinians that is now prevented, destroyed, and interrupted because of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. The genocide has not only ended lives, but also disrupted collective memory, erased the knowledge of change, and foreclosed the future possibility of community-driven change. However, we have to remember that knowledge produced through the emancipatory and the participatory action research is also what we have, like we have that right now, and we need to archive it, we need to remember it, we need to use it as, like those erased voices need to be here, and need to be known, and need to be followed, so we can do any type of rebuilding in Gaza, hopefully now and later after the end of the genocide. And with that, I end with this image. I don't know if you know or not, but the Gaza symbol is the phoenix as a bird. And Gaza have been rebuilt and damaged and rebuilt over the site of Gaza for more than 5,000 years in the past. And it didn't just rise from the death, it rised like the bird rises from the ashes. And from that, this is a very profound idea that reminds us that Gaza can also rise from the ashes, and people in Gaza can do that. But to do that, they can't do it alone. Resilience is not possible under genocide. What they need is all of us to stand together, to make an action, to be more than just in solidarity, but to make a real action with them and hold hands together to end the genocide, and hopefully then to rebuild everything that we had and to progress to the future. So just remember, action what we need, and solidarity, not empathy. Thank you.